Willem joined the ISS in 2013 in this post, which is now called Complex Threats in Africa Program. But before that, we have a real bomb disposal man here. And I have immense respect for anybody that will walk up to an explosive thing and persuade it not to go bang. It's a scary, difficult job and takes a very patient man. But he's been doing that since 1984. He worked in the VIP unit, the anti-hijack unit, crime intelligence, and above all, explosive unit. And he actually did the courses. He trained people in all of those units and the Special Task Force. He's also done a whole lot of work in West and East Africa. He spent 10 years in West Africa. So he's a man who knows the continent. Finally, Lieutenant General Fannie Masemola has been a senior manager in the South African police for 20 years. He's now Deputy National Commissioner of Policing. But above all, his current job is the chairperson of the NAT Joints, the operations center that networks all of the responses to crises in this country. So if he goes away in a hurry, we will know there's a crisis on. We have some wonderful people here. I'm going to start by asking Willem else. Could you talk about trends in terrorism and security across Africa, from Al-Shabaab to Boko Haram and the Mozambique terrorists? It's all yours, Willem.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yes, let's start with a brief overview of the history of terror in Africa and then bring it down towards our region. We see that terrorism and terror groups is not a new phenomenon in Africa. Even before the colonial era, we were exposed to terror. From Cairo in the north to Cape Town in the south, from Nouakchott in the west to Mogadishu in the east, the continent was exposed to acts of terror and terror attacks. The continent was introduced to modern terrorism, however, in 1998 with the twin attacks on the UN missions in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Those attacks were the first serious international terror attacks on African soil. It did not, however, stop there. Attacks were perpetrated in all regions of the continent. Now, who are these groups? These groups are all from all different cultures, race, and religion. And they perpetrate attacks and resorted to heinous acts of killing, maiming, abducting, intimidating innocent people to further their agenda. For instance, in Nigeria, you have groupings in the south like MEND, does not have any religious affiliation. And in Uganda, you have the Lord Resistance Army that claims to have a Christian manifest. Closer to home, we had Pagat, as well as the Muramach. They claim religion or other causes, but the fact boils down to criminality. So what are the causes of terrorism? There are many different causes, and we should always try to put it into context. They vary from environmental, cultural, economic, social, and political factors. You cannot always compare terrorism in Nigeria to terrorism in Somalia, as there are different drivers and that exist in different environments with different political and economical conditions. So how do we respond? These terror groups can come in different configurations: national groups, transnational groups, international groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda with an international reach. Challenges that we have to face with them in Africa on a daily basis. Another challenge that we have is that normally the response is not multifaceted, but we tend to move with a military response. Cultural, economic, and maybe dialogue may be the answer. There are some good examples in Mali where they started with that. Terror groups are opportunists and will thrive on conditions that are created and are ideal for them to operate in. We look at the country of Somalia, where the group of Al-Shabaab exploit and failed state and conditions created due to poor governance and internal tensions or conflict. How did we respond? The African Union brought together AMISOM in 2007. They gathered some troops from Kenya, Uganda, and Burundi, amongst others, and they mainly tried with a military intervention and peacekeeping efforts. The terror groups pushed back. We see that in 2010, during the final of the Soccer World Cup in Kampala, there were two massive explosions that killed many people. And not to forget what happened in Westgate, in Nairobi, where Al-Shabaab demonstrated that they can reach beyond the national borders of Somalia, and they are a regional factor. These groups can, however, not operate on the ground without support from local population. They exploit in anger, distrust, and dissent of the local people. The same situation occurs in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and other countries in that region. These groups have one objective and one common thing that bring them together, and they want to use violence and act of violence to instill fear to force change. The national groups like ISIS establish a foothold in the continent to drive their ambition to expand. In the DRC, groups like the ADF for allegiance. To bring it a bit closer to home, 2017, a local group that is known as Al-Shabaab amongst the local people in northern Mozambique in the Cabo Delgado province, they perpetrated their first attack. They made their intentions known. The town of Masemola prior, where they stated that they don't respect the government and they wanted to follow a strict interpretation of Islam and enforce it on the region.
Thanks,
SADC
Willem.
is a regional body. Yes, sir.
That was the 5 minutes. You can come back with SADC in due course. I'm now going to move to Jasmine Opperman. Thanks very much, Willem. That was a wonderful survey. Jasmine, tell us about the Islamist insurgency across the border. How did it come about and how fast is it growing? Does South Africa need to be worried about terrorism in Mozambique? It's all yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Prof. Should we be concerned to start off with that? Yes, we should be concerned. Must we get involved? Damn if we do, damn if we don't. We are in a situation where there's urgent policy intervention required, but saying that, it must go beyond military. The insurgency in Mozambique has started as far back as 2010 in terms of an extremist narrative. So when we talk extremism in Mozambique, we need to understand the local context, the local condition, an extremist interpretation that is unique to Mozambique, that has led to resentment, led to dissatisfaction, and caused the transfer into acts of violence. Since June last year, we have seen a massive increase in sophistication by these cells, by these organizations, which indicates clearly a foreign influence to direct the insurgency. The question in Mozambique now is, where do we stand with the Islamic State? And here we have to take care. The Islamic State, after the Caliphate, is focused on expansion beyond all means, even if ideological conviction to their narrative is not on par. That's not the issue for them. They've seen this opportunity, they've seen the insurgency, and the media propaganda is running full steam ahead, where they claim that they are taking lead in the insurgency. They are not taking lead in the insurgency. That there's a fingerprint, that there's a threshold that we must be careful of, without a doubt. We cannot afford to have the Islamic State finding an institutionalized presence. Sadly, what is happening now, government failure in terms of intervention, massive abusive behavior, and we call for military intervention. Those are going to be our partners. If we put set on that soil, we are going to become part of the problem. Hence, when we do decide that some form of coordinated SADC intervention is required, We have to be crystal clear in command and control, objectives, and what beyond the military. There is an immediate need for security. Let's not play around with beautiful concepts here in terms of, but we need to think about development. Those things are needed. But the people of Cabo Delgado is longing for immediate security. The area is devastated. MDP is under attack as we sit here this afternoon. Kidnappings, abusive behavior, and a recruitment stream being created by government policy that needs to be attended to as a matter of urgency.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. I'm now going to move to General Masemola. General, you are going to be in a hot seat here, whichever way you jump. But what has been South Africa's response to terrorism in Mozambique? And are you worried about it spilling over into South Africa? Is there a regional strategy for counterterrorism?
Thank you very much, Prof. With regard to the SADC region, we should be aware that as South Africa is part of the SADC, we do have what is called the Protocol on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation and the Mutual Defense Pact. And the SADC Organ on Politics and Security, which its secretariat is based in Botswana, is the one that is empowered to coordinate such matters. Currently, yes, it is more domesticated in the northern Mozambique, and surely the sovereignty of Mozambique will be acknowledged and respected here, so that they can deal with their domestic matters. And as South Africa, yes, we any other country that is a neighbor to Mozambique should be worried, but we cannot go and interfere in the sovereignty or matters of another country. But of course, as a country, yes, we continuously make sure that we are ready. We keep our forces ready. And of course, as a country, we are also part of the African Standby Force, which is controlled and regulated by the SADC Secretariat, the Organ on Politics and Security. So yes, we, just like all other SADC countries, we make sure that we take care of our domestic internal affairs. But currently, we think Mozambique is able to handle their domesticated matters, and they have got access to the SADC as well as the AU Africa Standby Force, which in case that country cannot manage, they will be able to assist. We will be aware that the Africa Standby Force, its operational readiness was validated some time ago in 2015 through the exercise codename Exercise Amani Africa, and we don't directly participate in AU as a country, but we participate through the SADC, and SADC is the one that can contribute to the problems that we might be seeing in Mozambique. Thank you.
Thanks very much, General. You have reminded us that Mozambique is a sovereign state and that there is a network of diplomatic and other ways of talking about any movement of troops or violent means across borders. And in particular, we have to use the SADC structures and we have to use the AU structures. All of which said, if there really is an intervention needed in northern Mozambique, what is the way whereby South Africa gets to do that? Jasmine, you wanted to talk.
I think there are two very important aspects we have to keep in mind here. One, we can discuss all options available to us. Where do we stand with the Mozambique government on this situation? If we look at their narrative at this point in time, we will protect our own sovereignty. So clearly there's a preference, it seems, within the Mozambican government for more bilateral engagements, relying on the status of diplomatic relations for the past few years within the region. But there's a second crux to this issue, and that is the involvement of mercenaries. If South Africa, via SADC, is going to decide to get involved, and heaven knows, I hope it is not a crisis management situation, because we are going to aggravate that insurgency. But if we decide, are we going to be in contravention of our own laws with a Dike advisory group that is currently making use of helicopters, providing air support, and there's a much debate about its effectiveness, but the question remains, how many civilians are being killed and how many insurgents are being killed? So the Mozambican government's position on mercenaries and on what they will allow cannot be ignored at this point in time.
Thank you very much. Willem, we have another issue. It's a bit like the coming of the internet. The world was one way before the coming of the internet, and it's totally different after the internet. So with this plague, COVID, the lung disease that's busy killing people, can you tell us what are the implications of COVID for how we deal with terrorism, with insurgency in Mozambique and generally in Africa, because it's going to change everything? What does COVID mean for this? Willem.
Thank you very much, Professor. We need to state that COVID is a new phenomenon in the world, and that we are learning to deal with it and to cope with it as we go. There are not a lot of research being done that we can rely on, so many of the things that we will say will be assumptions. But on that note, certainly in terms of terror and acts of terror, there has been an increase since the start of the pandemic. What we cannot determine is if the increase in the attacks can be attributed to the pandemic itself. But, however, the pandemic forced governments to implement certain responses that could have created an environment where terrorists might have exploited that environment. Countries became so focused on fighting the pandemic, and it seems that some of them have lost focus on countering the terrorists and the threat of terror. Some countries are abusing the situation, where they use the pandemic as an excuse to clamp down on the population that might further marginalize and radicalize the population. We saw another challenge with the pandemic is also mobility. Due to the lockdown that many countries have imposed, it became difficult for intelligence operatives to move around undetected, and it restricted their capacity to gather useful intelligence on these operators. They could not. We also saw that in some countries like Chad, since March, there was a major increase in the attacks during the COVID pandemic. Terror groups are not restricted by the closure of the ports of entry. They use the porous borders of the country, of the continent, to move around. We see, just an example, Boko Haram. They are based mainly in Nigeria, but we see that they're almost daily or weekly crossing the border to Cameroon, where they perpetrate attacks. And those attacks have certainly increased during the pandemic. We should, however, remember that these are all assumptions and that we do not have concrete evidence of empiric evidence to prove that. Some groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda even regarded the pandemic as a divine act to punish infidels and to prevent it, but they also prevented their followers to travel, and they told them that it was a divine intervention. So they tend to use the pandemic to recruit some more terrorists. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks very much, Willem. General, I had the privilege of attending that demonstration you mentioned in 2015 of the abilities of the African Crisis Response Force. And we saw a dozen countries from all over what is a huge continent put up both men and equipment, and it was very impressive. Nonetheless, there are endless complaints about the size of the South African defense budget. I imagine the police could do with more money. We need to know, will this response actually happen when it's needed? Could you tell us how effective the African Standby Force, African Capacity for Immediate Response to Crises is, and what the South African contribution will be given the budget problems? General Masemola.
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, well, budget is always a problem for each country, especially when you have to prioritize between various functions like your social related matters. So it becomes a problem in balancing the budget. But however, I'm not a spokesperson for the defense, but however, the defense force, they still exist, they have got the capability, and even all the SADC countries, each country have got their own force and they have got the capability. But one has to take note that yes, at this pressing moment where prioritizing is important, we have to currently prioritize more for the fight against the COVID-19. So it is quite pressing for all institutions, but that does not disable any law enforcement, and including the SNDF, to be prepared for any eventuality. I heard earlier you quoted somebody that said the defense force is training to deploy. We should take note that defense force do not necessarily train to deploy anywhere. It is their function to train to be ready in the country. So they don't have to train when they have to deploy anywhere. And same with the police in the country. Yes, we are affected, of course, by cost constraints in terms of budget, but we are still there out there to make sure that we are ready to fight whatever threats that pose a danger to the residents of this country or the inhabitants of this country.
Thank you very much, General. Jasmine Opperman. A terrorist can seldom get anywhere unless there is a real grievance among the people they're trying to work with. And for 200 years or 100 years, the north of Mozambique has seen itself as the little sister, the Cinderella of the Maputo government, or in the old days of Portugal. It's also close to other countries. Could you tell us which other countries have been or are involved in Mozambique's insurgency? And perhaps some more on that very important question you raised of what private military contractors are doing and whether they're actually any use. Are they effective at combating the insurgency? Have they got it right?
To come back to foreign influence, here I'm referring to specific cases that we do know of. There are foreign influences from Tanzania, from the DRC, and if you go back to Al-Sunna, often being referred to as the group in charge of the insurgency, your propaganda from Kenya, from specific individuals, played a very prominent role. So there has been from Tanzania, from the DRC, and from Kenya, very specific influences that has been present and is still being present in the insurgency. If we talk about regional vulnerability, the country most vulnerable for an overspill effect is Tanzania, because it borders Cabo Delgado, because it's a porous border, and because of a maritime security in the ocean, providing a convenient supply stream without any detection at hand. And that is then where we have to ask ourselves as a region, if we talk about the risk to the rest of the region, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about an overspill of attacks beyond Tanzania? Highly unlikely. I don't see such a situation presenting itself, for example, in South Africa, because of the localized and geographical confines of the insurgency itself. Prof, your second question?
The second question was going back to your remark about private military contractors. How effective are they? Are they doing the job? Can we all relax because they are there, or is there an issue?
No, we can't. I always say +1 is better than 0. What DAG has offered is air support that was much needed by the ground forces. But during the last interview by Colonel Dyke himself, he admitted that there are constraining factors, that there is no coordination, that soldiers are not well trained, that time over target is a problem. Hence, they're moving their central bases from where they're going to operate. You are sitting with a group like DAG. They are only loyal to their paymaster. They're there to do a job. Have they made an impact? Yes. They have provided the air support that was needed. Have they killed insurgents? Yes, they have killed insurgents. But the problem remains. You're sitting with the privatization of war in the fight against extremists. And that leads to intense dissatisfaction, to the extent last week where locals referred to security forces as terrorists themselves. Like a local said to me, we fear the security forces, the insurgents, and the sound of choppers. So the mercenaries, irrespective of vital function one might argue it is providing, is not resolving the insurgency. At best, it is containing the insurgency.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. I'm going to move to Willem and to issues of migration. What threats do illegal migrations pose on security, and why are so many people moving? And this is going to be difficult to answer because, of course, theoretically, nobody's moving into South Africa, and COVID has stopped migration all over the place. But I'm going to guess migrations continue. Can you tell us what threats migrations have with regard to security?
Thank you, Professor. In Africa, migration has been happening for some time. We see in the north that there is migration moving towards Europe, and we see in the rest of Africa that countries as far as Somalia, people are coming down to South Africa, Uganda, Ethiopia, Nigeria. So we have a huge influx of migrants to South Africa, because these people, you know, when I speak to the people in the countries that we move in, all of them have a cousin or family member that moved to South Africa because they believe that there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and that is not necessarily always true, because we see that with the research that has been done, that some of these migration is being facilitated by organized crime. We see an increase in human smuggling, gun smuggling, drugs tend to also be very much involved and very much part of the huge migration drive that is happening. Countries like South Africa struggle with the management of migration and the challenges posed to that, as we do not have all the resources always to deal effectively with the situation, but it also gave rise and opportunities for corruption to stick out its ugly head. So with the terrorism cases that is currently in court in South Africa, we saw that there are various people from countries like Malawi, Somalia, and Ethiopia that have been charged. So we see that they do not only come to do what they normally say is that they're coming for a better life, they're coming for work, but some of them also tend to become involved with these heinous crimes of terror. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks very much, Willem. I have a question then for General Masemola. Leaving aside Mozambique, what are our domestic sovereign security threats in South Africa? Is domestic terrorism a reality? And given the coronavirus problem, how has this affected Nat Joints' activities? At Nat Joints, is domestic security a problem during coronavirus?
Thanks very much, Prof. Yeah, firstly, your first question. Well, in terms of domestic security, well, the law enforcement agencies in South Africa, continuously they prepare for themselves to deal with whatever action that comes, and we continuously
We're going to get to Q&A after this, okay?
We always make sure that we get them ready, and whatever comes, we deal with them. You might have seen incidents now and then. In the few years ago, you have seen how we dealt with the Budama, and now and then we do find some extremists that are being dealt with. We are quite, in terms of security, we are quite okay. I think we don't have, we are able to manage the threats. Well, during the COVID-19, as the national joints, which is a structure consisting of mostly the security departments, but for now, during the COVID, we extended it to all departments, and we deal with also both measures to prevent reduce infection, but also security measures that we are doing. We are quite doing our best under the circumstances of COVID-19, because we are not immune, but we have been able to assist the other departments, including the Department of Health, in terms of supporting them when they are doing all measures in terms of testing or whatever they are doing with or screening of communities. We have been involved. But of course, one of the elements that becomes problematic in South Africa is then the issue of immigration, where then you will find that our neighboring countries, most people are starting to come to the south, smuggling contraband, including your other things like your liquid cigarettes. So we are deployed, and we are making sure that the country is safe, but we do have those challenges where you have immigrant communities increasing in this country, and that becomes a challenge for resources in terms of policing. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks very much, General, and I'm sure we're all grateful for the good work the police are doing. We are now going back to the moderator for the question and answer session. Hand it over.
Thank you very much, Professor Christie, and thank you to your panel as well. As we go to the Q&A session, Professor Christie, please do expect my invoice, as you've asked Lieutenant General Masemola a question I was about to pose. So I will be invoicing you, sir. So the first question is, civil unrest seems to be on the rise. What are the reasons for this, and will the social, political, and economic fallout from the virus pandemic make matters worse?
Right. Now, quite who wants to answer that, I don't know, but I think I'm going to go to the general on that one because it's his job.
I can ask the question again, General, if you'd like.
No, thanks. I think I got the question. Yeah, the matters of civil unrest. You'd recall that during the state of disaster, protests are not allowed. But however, because of various reasons, we have seen during the winter time, there was a moment, there was load shedding for a few days. So yes, communities do start protests when it comes to service delivery matters, be it electricity, water, which are the basic needs. And then, yes, you do find that communities are becoming more aware of their rights and they go out and they protest. But up to so far, we have been able to contain the situation in the country. And of course, yes, countrywide, we would say yes, there is a bit of increase. We have seen in Western Cape, in Gauteng, where there were a bit of protest, but we are handling the situation. And of course, it's also compounded by the problem of where you find that the workers demand a salary increase in one or another, which was promised, and because of COVID-19, is unaffordable by various municipalities. So yes, those are the challenges that we do have in the country, but we are managing quite well for now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, General. The last question is, given that we've spoken about terrorism in Mozambique, what other terrorist threats in Africa stand out for you? Like what other threats are there on the continent with regards to terrorism?
Given Willem Else's extensive experience in West Africa and other places, Willem, you answer this.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, Africa has got a long history of terrorism, as I mentioned in the introduction. And it seems to me that for some reason we are inclined to let me put it very diplomatically, we're inclined to create such circumstances for people to be radicalized and people to be descended, people who to be mad. And if you look at the different regions, if you look at Malawi, not Malawi, sorry, at Somalia. In Somalia, we see that it's a failed state. We created that failed state through poor governance, and what happened after that is that it was chaos. And you see that these terrorists and terrorist organizations, they thrive in conditions of chaos. We saw what happened at the moment in Libya, where Libya is in a civil war, but also you've got the terrorist groups that use it as a springboard to attack countries like Mali and Niger from the north. So we see an unrest, a general unrest, and a general insurgency of these groupings in the Sahel region. We see that very interesting that different groupings, like for instance Boko Haram and other groups that are affiliated with ISIS, they seem to be working together with groups like the JNIM that is actually affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They are at war in Syria and elsewhere, but in West Africa, they tend to work together for a common purpose and a common goal, and that is to try to occupy large swatches of land and to make their inroads there. They also move into Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is extremely unstable at the moment, where there is a huge insurgency, and we see that they tended to increase under the pandemic conditions that are hampering the. We also see that, as Jasmine rightly said, that you have the challenges in Mozambique. In Mozambique, it started to escalate in 2017. We saw huge escalation even during the pandemic period. And fortunately, there seemed to be some stabilization in the attacks, where there was a pushback from government with the assistance of the DAG group that she was using. So in general, we see that as long as we have these conditions and we create these conditions that are conducive for these radical groups to thrive, they are going to move in and they will destabilize the country.